My name is Ifeoma Malo. Everyone calls me Ify. I'm a climate champion from the West African country of Nigeria. I run a hub called Clean Technology Hub. It's a hybrid hub focused on energy access, climate change, and sustainable entrepreneurship. And we do five things. Those five things around the three pillars I just mentioned are research, policy engagement, programmatic endeavors and ventures, entrepreneurship building, and advocacy and trainings. We work across 7 other African countries trying to drive sustainable entrepreneurship and climate adaptation and mitigation, including using renewable energy to electrify last mile and deep rural communities. We've been existing in Clean Tech Hub for about 8 years, but I've been doing this work for up to 12 years now. I'm happy to be here. As somebody who does a lot more field work and working with community to drive climate adaptation and mitigation, we come across several communities that are already being impacted. So think about the floods that happened in September, October, and even November last year, and across the West African coast. So several countries like Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and even Ghana were affected by those floods. And you had entire communities that were wiped away, literally wiped away by the floods. So people had to migrate. And with those migration comes, an added layer of issues. People were having to start over their livelihoods from scratch. In those sorts of situations, and while that was going on, by the way, you also had the other climate issues that were happening in other parts of the country and other parts of Africa, especially East Africa, around droughts. And so completely affecting agriculture and our food chain. So one of the work that we've been doing, even before the floods, was working with smallholder farmers in several communities on how to be more climate adaptable in their farming practices and in their food storage practices. And this work has us working with even women smallholder farmers in these communities who have been used to farming in their own indigenous ways for a long time, but also having a lot of indigenous knowledge around the weather patterns in their communities. So what we did was to come and layer on their indigenous knowledge to help build a lot more greener and sustainable farming. So teaching them how to plant their farm produce using new cropping mechanisms and using, soil overlays to help them retain their agricultural produce. And we've worked with a bunch of female farmers to do this. And we find that they're the ones who are quicker to make that shift and that adaptation. Working sometimes with in communities of families, their clans to sort of aggregate their farming and land together, and then adopting this technique so that they can get to scale. One of the things that we did in one of the communities we went to was to then layer on storage opportunities using solar to create green renewable storage for their produce. So women who farm tomatoes and pepper, and which if they don't sell in 3 days would be completely, not useful, or they would be unable to sell it to customers. So what then happens is that by providing them cold storage facilities on a lease to own basis, they're able to store their tomatoes and pepper for about 10 days rather than 3 days. And before the 10 days, you find that they are able to sell off all of their produce rather than having a lot of waste. So you see that these are some of the things that we see as success rates that makes it imperative that we continue to work with indigenous communities, local farmers, to provide adaptation measures that will lead to food security and to also lead to better food outputs, food system output. I think it's important to contextualize it. It's a building that actually reduces a lot of the emissions and is wired in terms of its electricity output to use less electricity than would ordinarily be used. So even beyond the cement and the sort of carbon that is generated by using cement for construction, a green building would typically have solar type refrigerators or low emission ACs, air conditions, or heaters. So things that will consume less electricity. And to answer your question, simply, I think one of the things that we've struggled with on the continent is to actually have policies that are sustainable and take into account the emerging green economy. There's been a lot of attempts by several countries to write into their building codes and their construction policies why it is necessary to use more sustainable materials. And it's important to understand that there's going to be pushback because for many years now, we've used cement as a source of building. And even more importantly, we have trained all our technicians and our artisans to use cement for building. So when we're trying to transit to a new sort of building mechanisms and using new types of equipment that are more sustainable, there has to be a paradigm shift in the thinking, in the policy, but also in the training of the people who are going to do the actual construction. And the latter two are where you have a bit more challenges. So one of the things that I see that's happening in some of the East African countries and a few West African countries is that there is now a concerted effort in a lot of our technical schools to upskill a lot of the builders, the trade schools as well, the people who are learning how to put in tiles, how to construct buildings, how to construct roads, on how to use some of these new materials. For instance, plastic is now one of the things that are used in green construction, and trying to replace cement. And in some places also used to replace asphalt for roads, for roads. But then it's how do you smelt the plastic so that, it's also addressing both the plastic waste issue, but also doing it in a way that also creates roads that won't disintegrate after a few years. And getting people to understand the science behind using those technologies. So when we talk about green buildings and green construction, it's a holistic view on how we create homes and sustainable structures using equipment and using technologies that will reduce emission. And in this case, one of the things Africa has is an advantage because we still have a housing deficit and we have road deficits. So it's easier for us to transition to using this sort of greener technologies and equipment right away. There are about 3 or 4 African countries that I know of that have adopted or have put together an energy transition plan, Nigeria being one of them, South Africa being another. And in these countries, there's a concerted effort by the governments to prepare their countries, especially their business communities, on how they are viewing the energy transition before 2030, 2040. Many of them have very large ambitions about how this transition is going to look. And those targets, are great in terms of the numbers. But what I think needs to be done is actually to put more concerted effort into educating the populace on what this means for their businesses, what this means for their livelihoods, what this means for their communities, and in the long run, how they can actually then entrench their community activities or their ventures and enterprises within this energy transition plan. If you're telling a local man in a village, a local man or woman in a village who have been used to doing business in a certain way that they have to stop because it's hurting the environment or the climate, you have to also tell them what is it that they have to do to continue their businesses, but in a way that does not hurt the environment. And sometimes that's missing in our education, because when people hear that there is a policy that's coming in place for energy transition or for climate mitigation, Most of what we hear is ban, 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 ban. We're banning this, we're banning that. But then how then do we, if we're banning plastics and single-use plastic, how then do we make sure that those that are using this plastic for their businesses, that there is a way to help transition them into much more sustainable replacements of those plastics, replacement technologies for those plastics, or if they have plastics, then how do we get them into second and third usage to make a case for this is how we can eliminate just the single use and have them for multiple use, which gets into the whole circularity argument. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. In terms of policy, the just energy transition, one of the things that's happened is a bit of dichotomy in the way that this conversation has been framed. We've seen a lot of the Western countries have pushed for an energy transition model, and energy transition policies for us to be able to meet our climate targets, global climate targets, and to keep the 1.5 ceiling when it comes to carbon emission, to keep all of that under the 1.5 ceiling. But, since the Ukraine war started, we've seen a lot of rollback by Western countries in terms of their own energy transition plan and their carbon targets. And what that has done is it has shifted the conversation a lot in many other African countries around whether they should continue to do their energy transition plans and their modeling it after the West, or whether they should take into account their own local peculiarities. As a result of that, when now that a lot of countries are drafting their own energy transition plans, what they are now doing is to look at, what their own local context is. In Nigeria, because we have huge gas deposits, the government has in its wisdom said that they're going to use gas as a short-term transition. And this has sort of negated some of the arguments around should we go use more renewables like wind or even geothermal, which were also options at the time. But you're seeing that debate has shifted the discourse. And then the question is also, how then do you transition the oil producing communities? What are you transitioning them to? Because for the longest time, the oil has been, or the gas has been their livelihood, their source of livelihood, and their economic realities in their communities. And so for these energy transition plans that are emerging, it's now on a country by country basis, all still looking at the 1.5 ceiling, all setting ambitious targets. I think what then needs to be done is to go and domicile these energy transition plans in municipalities and local governments, and then have them try to implement it in their own way. There's a lot of work to be done on implementation when it comes to the ETP, and that's where we need to keep our gaze on and our focus on. Women will be at the forefront and would lead in shaping what each country's energy transition plan will be, both at a macro level, a meso level, and a micro level. In Nigeria, when we talk about clean cooking, women bear the brunt of cooking in the homes. And one of the things we found in our research and in some of the data that we collect is that, energy poverty wears a woman's face because they're the most affected, especially those in communities and those who have to travel far to get firewood for cooking, or even sometimes for lighting. And so the question of how you transition these women from how they have been living, traveling for kilometers and miles to go get firewood, it's actually an easy one to have with them when they know that they're going to be safer by staying in their homes and having energy that is easily available by using cleaner cooking stoves. When they know that they're going to be able to make meals on time for their children who are coming back from school because they are not traveling far to go and get the sources of fuel. When they know that the risk of sexual abuse or even their safety and there's reduced danger around their safety. These are things that you don't have to tell a woman who's in the line of fire twice to know that, transitioning to a cleaner method of cooking is in her own interest. And then you layer on the health benefits of transitioning to these cleaner methods of cooking, the smoke inhalation that a lot of the women who use traditional methods of cooking have to face, and the impact on their health on the long run, with the increase in cancer and the increase in all sorts of other diseases in their body. You find that they're more easier to convince. The question we then have, and what we have seen on the field, is how do we get them, because behavioral change is very hard, how then do we get them to sustain using those cleaner methods? And that's where the measurement and evaluation and the check-ins are very important. What we do is that we bundle these women into communities and help them work through how they want to manage those communities. And you see that once you give them that sort of opportunity, they self-organize, and then they take on checking in on each other to make sure that, people are not going back or defaulting back to using firewood or kerosene for lighting and for cooking. So women really are the champions when it comes to the energy transition. One of the most important ones that I think that jumps out for me is teaching women how to maintain these clean cook stoves that are given to them or that they purchase. Women are much more, in tune with the economics in the home. So if they've invested, even if it's $2 to get a clean cook stove, and they know that, it's, that if anything happens to it, that there are people within the communities that can actually then fix it, you will see that there's a bigger inclination to continue to use the cook stoves, to purchase them, and then to continue to use them. What has happened is that some of these clean cook stoves that are brought into the continent are not made here. And so that they are not fabricated in a way that takes into account our local sources of fuel. So briquette making, for instance, to fire the stoves, different communities have different resources for briquette making. So if you're now fabricating a stove, or you're modeling a stove for fabrication, are you taking into account the kind of briquettes that can be used in Tanzania and Uganda, or the ones that can be used in Sierra Leone and Nigeria in the West, or the ones that can be used in Namibia, in Southern Africa, or Lesotho? So how are you looking at their source, how the community is organized, and how their sources of briquettes or lighting these clean cook stoves are? I think this is a big question that those who produce stoves, especially stoves en masse, need to take into account. But where in the communities where this has been gotten right, you find that women then adopt not just the clean cook stoves, they start to make briquettes for commercial purposes. So they become sellers of briquettes in the way that you find people who sell matches and matchsticks or lighters. Briquette making for commercial purposes then becomes the thing. And because women are so entrepreneurial, right? They're always seeing opportunities. Africans generally are very entrepreneurial, but because of women who are the ones who manage the economics at home, they're always looking for add-ons to any technology that you introduce to them. So one of the trends that we've seen that is very interesting is the briquettes for commercial purposes, where women are now making it to sell to other people who don't have the time or who don't have the energy to make those briquettes and just want to buy them. My own personal view, and this is our view at Clean Tech Hub, is that it's not an either-or situation. It is true that using renewable energy and clean energy is a lot more expensive. You can't, and secondly, you can't use it to power industries yet in a sustainable way. So when the Western countries are saying we need you to go greener, what African countries are saying, we will, but give us time, because we're not the ones who are the biggest polluters. And secondly, we also want to build our own economies at scale. And the cheapest way to do it is using going with the more fossil dependent energy sources. This is why we're very happy with some of the energy transition plans that we've seen that creates a hybrid approach In Nigeria, like I said, we have gas as a transition fuel, and a way to phase out oil, focused on gas, and then later on using much more renewable. The second thing I think is important to note, beyond having transition fuels, is to also, if the West is really keen and really means that they want to see us transition, it's important that they also support a lot of the production of renewable energy technologies on the continent. We cannot industrialize or electrify a continent by importing, solar panels and batteries from Europe and China. There's no way that's going to happen. It's just going to be, another import-dependent market. What would be helpful is if we're able to assemble or produce our own solar panels on the continent, our own batteries on the continent. Not only are we going green in that way, then we're also providing jobs that would help our own technicians, our own engineers, our own local job support entrepreneurs become, much more economically stable, and also begin to grow the economy and our GDPs on the continent. But, continuing to import everything isn't going to help. So when development agencies and even global philanthropies are then giving money for a greener economy, they need to make demands to say, we want to see manufacturing plants for solar panels or for renewable energy technologies on the continent so that those things are produced here. That's the only way that we can then begin to address or even begin to believe that there's a just transition that also takes into account African countries. When I advise governments on the continent about this energy transition and the just transition debate, one of the things that I say to them is, despite how the West has acted in terms of going back on their commitments to go greener and to reduce emissions, because they are facing their own energy crisis since the Ukraine war. The other thing we have to also understand is the geopolitics, of the whole energy transition debates. The truth is that, Africa without its own money, Africa without its own financing has to be dependent on the West for some of the development funds that they need to green their economies. If we had all the money in the world, I think, the African Union coming together with all of the heads of states to say, this is how we're designing our own energy transition plan would make sense. Specifically because we're a codependent economy on the continent. One of the things that I always say is the energy transition is going to happen anyway. The questions the heads of states and the governments in Africa need to ask is, at what point do we want to play in this energy transition? Do we want to get left behind? Africa is already behind on a lot of indices. So if the rest of the world then decides to transition in a few years when there's a lot more energy stability, would we still be behind? Is there a space for us to now get ahead of the curve, knowing that a lot of the European countries are still also getting involved in their own energy transition mechanisms? And the question for me is, yes, we absolutely should take advantage of the energy transition mechanisms that are coming up. Design it to suit your own country, but make sure that you're setting targets that it's going to put you above the curve. Because listen, the truth of the matter is, whether we like it or not, the world is going to go green. We've already seen that happening with a lot of the global oil and gas companies now opening up a transition office, an energy transition desk, or an energy transition department, or even a renewable energy department in their oil and gas companies. So big oil and gas companies are now thinking of going green, are playing in the carbon market, are thinking about how to decarbonize. African states on their own cannot then say, we don't think this is fair, so in this way that we're not going to be players. What they need to do is to collectively define what the terms of the energy transition would mean for the continent, and then an individual states then set their own targets that are realistic to make sure that their voices are on the table and that they're key stakeholders and key decision makers in how we transition. I think the last thing I was going to say on this particular question is, one of the things that we also have to understand outside of the geopolitics is also the fact that we stand at an advantage now because, you know, like I said, with so much left to be done. For instance, when you talk about Kenya being at 98%, one of the things that happened at the Energy Indaba in Cape Town earlier this year in February was that the AU, in conjunction with some other partners, with NEPAD, and I can't remember, I think the Energy Commission of Africa and African Energy Commission, has brought up a document called the African Integrated Energy Network, where it allows nation states to sell power, you know, that is generated from one country to the other at a reasonable price, at, you know, at market prices, but reasonable considering the brother to brother, sister to sister, Ubuntu type network that the AU is trying to emphasize. And what that means is that if Kenya, for instance, is able to generate a lot more energy than it needs, it's able to sell to its neighbors in Uganda, in Rwanda, in Tanzania, for instance, and, you know, sell the excess to them while retaining the much that it needs. And that would also force those neighboring countries to then decide that they want to go greener, because then, you know, it's giving them the mechanics of how their neighbor is doing this and going green and being able to achieve net zero, to also implement some of those borrowed policies from across the pond into their own energy and electrification plans. So absolutely, I mean, this works in terms of how countries sell power to each other, but it also works in terms of how countries exchange knowledge sharing and exchange technologies with each other. There are four ways that I sort of think this is the way to design the policy, the green energy transition policies on the continent. The first one is the education piece. You know, I think there has to be an active education modeling across the continent on what green transition means, what energy transition means, and how it is beneficial to communities. And use test cases. For instance, we know that drought is a problem in East Africa. We know that the floods are a problem in West Africa. How do you design education models and communication and advocacy models that speaks to each region's specific context? If you come to Nigeria in the places where the flood has decimated communities, if you use something else that is not relative to what they're going through now, you've missed it. There's nothing that they would hear about energy transition that will make sense to them. But if you situate their current displacement and situation around, this is what is happening with the climate. That's why we're trying to create, you know, this climate policies and energy transition policies to mitigate the carbon emissions and make sure that communities like yours are not really impacted. That's the message they need to hear, and replicate it in each other region using their particular circumstances. So education is number one. Number two is also to model behavioral change. One of the hardest things to do when you create or enact a policy or a law is behavioral change, getting people to obey or to understand. So this is why we advocate for the carrot and the stick. In doing the education and modeling behavioral change, one of the things we are saying is that we also want to teach Africans about the carbon markets. It is important that African entrepreneurs, whether small, micro, medium, and big and large corporations, understand the growing carbon markets, because that's where a lot of the money is going to be at. How do they calculate their carbon emissions? And how are they able to use those carbon emissions to trade and increase their own livelihoods and their yields and, you know, build their own local economies? If the only people that understand what carbon markets, this emerging carbon markets are the Western countries, then Africa continues to remain at a disadvantage. So defining what the carbon markets are in relation to the training and education, and getting people to know how to do their own carbon calculation, and helping them onboard them into the carbon markets, emerging carbon markets economy, I think is critical also. So remember, it's education, behavioral change, and then as part of that education and behavioral change, introduce them to things like the carbon market. And then thirdly, I think it's also important that when we're designing policies, we also let communities lead. I find that there's a very top-down approach to policy enactments across the continent, where most times when communities are engaged is when the policies have been fully formed. I think we have to do a reverse engineering on that and get the communities first to first define what they think that policy should be, especially after you've educated them on what it means and how it's going to affect them. Then give them the platform to then lead on championing what should be in the policy and then taking it on. You have quicker adoption of those policies in that way. And lastly, there must be penalties. You know, when you enact a policy, there must be penalties for people who then go against those policies or refuse to meet with them. Because there's an absence of accountability in many of our countries, you will not get any traction with energy future, a sustainable energy future, if you do not create, you know, like I said, the carrot and stick, but enact policies that will make sure that people who are not keeping to those policies are not rewarded for their bad behavior. I think that will send a signal to everyone else that this is the way I want to go. And then lastly, I would say young people. It is important because of our youth population to have young people also be the ones who are co-championing what this energy future would be and would look like. In a lot of the forums that I go in, young people are increasingly getting angry and frustrated with our generation, the generation before us, about what's happening to the climate. And I think it's important that we listen to them and we involve them in a lot of the policy, the legislative process, and also the community building process that is going to be necessary for this climate future that we talk about.